Hi everyone, welcome back to our podcast Reinventing Real Estate. This is episode 9. I'm Jenna Harris and we are super excited today to have Dan Batterton here with us from L&G. And Dan has been at L&G for over 17 years and pioneered the BTR space, which is incredible to have someone who was at the kind of inception point of BTR in the UK and has truly kind of revolutionised how people live today. So we're incredibly excited to have you here. So thank you for joining us.
Welcome. Great to be here.
So I guess what we kind of love to do is dive into that personal journey element. And it would be lovely to, hear from you kind of reflecting on that 17 years, how you've seen not only your role within the space, but the sector itself evolve. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. Well, if I start at Legal & General, we'll start there. 17 years ago, that feels like a long time. When I joined to help set up an investor relations team. So there wasn't really any sort of specific team that was looking after the investors in the real estate business. So I joined pretty much certainly to the month of when Bill Hughes joined the real estate business as well. So we joined about the same time. And I worked in investor relations and investment strategy, setting up funds, speaking to lots of investors about what they wanted, looking at investment strategy in commercial real estate. And I did that for 6 or 7 years. And then I was asked a question by Bill in the way that he does in a throwaway comments, which was, can you explain why we don't invest into residential in the UK? And whilst you're working it out, can you explain how we're going to do it? And another 10 years later, there I am still doing it. I just found it really interesting. And I think, I used to think, God, it would be great if I just wanted to be a teacher or a doctor or something. Like I knew from when I was a kid what I really wanted to do. And I was probably 40 when I worked out what I actually found really passionate in work about housing, and specifically the rental part of housing. But it took me, till I was 40 to find out what I was really passionate about, wanted to keep going on doing. So we worked out a strategy. The stars aligned in that we found a seed investor who backed us in what we wanted to do, who were PGGM, as a Dutch fund manager. And we bought a couple of sites and we got going. And to start with, it really was making it up as we went along. I guess the benefit of being there at the beginning is there's nobody to tell you you've got it wrong.
Yeah.
You can be as innovative as you want. We kept falling back on saying everything was really long term. So come and tell us in 40 years if it was a wrong decision, because we thought we probably wouldn't be around in 40 years, so we'll be all right. But yeah, it was
held accountable.
Yeah,
that's the good one.
Yeah. But through that early start and the setup, we had to set up some principles in a way I don't think we've ever really done in commercial real estate. Some principles about what we stood for, because residential is just so much more emotive. It's personal. We had to work out what we stood for and built around what we stood for in terms of the way we designed the buildings, where they were, how we were going to run them. Everything fed off a small number of principles around what we wanted to stand behind, really.
And if you kind of take us back to that first scheme, mm-hmm. What was it that you kind of saw? What was the vision?
Mm-hmm. I'd had the fortune of travelling to a number of other countries as part of the research on what the strategy was going to be to look at what the rental sector was around the world. The first thing was sort of a professional institutional rental sector existed in most places. The UK was the outlier, that it didn't exist in the UK. And also then it was really location specific, culturally specific. So an institutional rental scheme in Finland would have a sauna on the top floor and it would have a bomb shelter in the basement. And God. That would be the amenity. And you go to the US and even in the US, what really struck me in the US was it's different even within the one country. So if you go to Chicago, this is sweeping statement. So any US listeners, this is sweeping, and I apologize when I get it wrong. But if you go to Chicago, big living spaces, small bedrooms, smallish bedrooms, but it's all about communal space and places where you can sit with your friends in lounges and living rooms. And then you go to Texas, and for some reason nobody's ever explained to me, it feels like the biggest room is the ensuite bathroom. Enormous ensuite bathrooms. I don't know if people in Texas spend a long time in the bathroom, but the biggest room would be the ensuite. That is not somewhere you invite people to. And then tiny baths. Why in the States do they have really small baths?
So strange.
A bit shorter than your leg, so you can't.
You have to curl up when you're inside.
Yeah, but anyway, the principle of all of what we learned from that was that everything has to be location specific. The design has to be location specific. The offering, and that's the same across the UK. So our first scheme was not that far from where we are now in Walthamstow. And it was right next to the reservoirs that is North London's drinking water. And shame on me, having lived in London for 20 years, I didn't know we had 13 miles of reservoir in North London. But we were right on the banks of that. So the design was all around getting height and getting the views around across the wetlands. And then it was, I guess, the fun bit of, well, what amenities are we going to put in? You know, we've got all these apartments, what amenities are we going to put in? And that's where some of the principles started coming in. So the principles were, let's accept that everybody wants to own a home. I don't really accept that, but let's accept that as a principle because it makes it a lot easier to speak to politicians if you say that's really what you think. And so we assumed, let's assume people are going to leave our building at some point, but let's make it really hard for them to leave. So let's give them something that they couldn't have if they owned a home. What lifestyle offers, amenities can we give them that they can't have if they owned a home? And as a small team at the time, as 3 or 4 of us, we sat down and one person said, I've always wanted a swimming pool in my house. All right, swimming pool. I'd love to have a gym at home. Yeah, gym. My contributions were, I like beer and pizza. So I would like a pizza restaurant and a bar, right? Let's put beer and pizza down. And we sort of went through things. It'd be great if there was somebody to pick up our Amazon delivery, and I'd like to be able to work from home a bit. But really, I want to be able to watch the football on a big screen and not have to pay for my subscription because it's communal. All of these sort of things. We wrote down a long list. So, and the idea was let's ensure that renting is offering something different to home ownership. So it's got its strengths and it's got its weaknesses, but let's have it as a different offering to home ownership. And that, it felt like some of the most creative time we had when we were sitting down, not even pre-plans, working out what we would like to include and what we were going to try and stand for in the rental sector.
I think it's so interesting, isn't it? Because it's almost a blank slate, and it's daunting but also incredibly refreshing to have the opportunity to totally sculpt a new asset class. And there are kind of times in people's lives or in generations where you can come across that, and I think it's really interesting to hear about how you guys kind of approach that. And on a personal level, what was your kind of excitement or ambition when you first looked at those plans and looked at that kind of creativity? Because I suppose you did build a business within legal in general, but also at the same time you built or contributed towards building the wider BTR industry in what it is today. So I think it's just so interesting to hear that.
I think that it's the potential scale that's just so enormous. We've got such a housing problem in the UK. I try and explain to investors, them going, are you worried about oversupply? And I go, well, not during my career. There will be an undersupply of housing during the rest of my career. We've got multiple decades of undersupply. We've got a poor quality rental sector in terms of the quality of the buildings. So that is fact that the average rental house is worse than the average owner-occupied house in terms of quality. So there's such an opportunity to improve. And I used an example when it comes to the operational side. I used an example that I rented from an institutional landlord, and I won't say who they were, but I had a good experience. And I had a fridge magnet, and that fridge magnet had a phone number on it. And if anything went wrong, I needed to just phone that phone number in. And I lived there for 5 years, and I phoned it once. And I thought the quality of service was out of this world because I had a fridge magnet. And in hindsight, I realised, gosh, if a fridge magnet I consider is good service in the rental sector, there's a lot of opportunity to improve the quality of service. And that all of those abilities to change, it doesn't really seem like rocket science. We can go and look at other countries, which is great. But the opportunity, the freedom comes scale and time. So our scheme in Walthamstow is 479 apartments. With 479 apartments, the cost to add a swimming pool is a fairly small number divided by 479.
Yeah.
There's a lot more ability to innovate and play and make mistakes when you've got a large scale. And the same, the cost to provide a service when you're dividing it over so many apartments. And I guess where we are now, jump forward 6 or 7 years, we've got 10,000 apartments. And that infrastructure that sits behind to deliver the service is divided across 10,000 apartments. So we should be able to keep getting, it's not necessarily economies of scale, if there can be economies of scale without being economic, but there are service quality economies of scale that should keep coming through as we get bigger and bigger.
How do you, I suppose, having that scale now, still deliver that, individualized service that I imagine you were really passionate about at the beginning? And is that fear real that people have from going from, 1 or 2 assets to, tens of assets or hundreds of assets, that you do lose some of that integrity?
Yeah, maybe there are 2 bits to that. One is when we started out on deal number 1, I was sitting there with architects and red pens being scribbled over plans and things changing. And I am the son of an architect. I should put that out there just to
So you're quite well placed clear. Then for this.
Yeah, and I thought, this is going to be great. I'm going to spend the next part of my career designing stuff, and I'm going to walk around buildings and think that's there because I thought we should put the wall there, not there. I quickly realised that the design skills are not genetic. They did not follow through the family, and it was not my skill set. So I was involved in some of those early designs, but really, there are much better people to look at that than me. In terms of the individual, maybe when we look at our buildings, we still brand each building individually in its location. We have chosen not to put an overarching brand over the top, and some of our competitors, peers have, which is fine. We haven't done because at the moment we're focused on that individual building in that individual location, and I think the marginal benefit of somebody choosing to move from one of our London buildings to one of our Manchester buildings, the economics of that is so small, it's not worth the value of establishing that overarching brand. It's not to say we won't do it at some point, but on our leases there's a small little L&G umbrella, so our residents know L&G is the landlord, but the primary brand is rooted in that location. And when we're trying to do the design and what amenities are going in there, we try and work out who's going to live in that building and therefore what will they value. So it still has to be local. And even when we're operating it, the amount of furniture we have to put in a building in Manchester compared to London is different, compared to Bath and Bristol is different. The market is different. What people expect when they rent is different in different locations.
So even though, I suppose what you're saying is, even though it is large scale, it does have that bespoke element as a kind of integral piece of each one of your schemes.
Yeah. So we've got, 12, 13 up and built operational schemes, and we've got another 12 under construction. And each one has a team on site, and they run that discrete building. and they're responsible for running events and getting the community together, and they're just looking at that building and not the wider portfolio. We get the data of all of those buildings, and we look at them in aggregate and maybe give a bit of advice on things that are working on one scheme and not working on another scheme. But we try and let those on-site teams run their own local communities. And they're pretty big. You know, our smallest scheme has 300 people living in it, and our largest scheme in Wandsworth will have nearly 2,000 people living in it. That's a village.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we can go and let our general managers go and run those as they see fit in those locations.
Amazing.
You obviously talk about data, and data is obviously such a massive element of our industry and the living sector in general. And I think people are just really getting their heads around how they can utilize data effectively, or how they can optimize the schemes based on data collected. And I think as an owner of operational real estate, you are in a very different situation because you have access to that data. So, sorry,
We'll all have a cough. There we go.
Just I'd repeat the question.
Okay. Sorry, Dan.
It's all right. It allowed me to have a cough.
Right. So, you know, in our industry, obviously data is such a critical part of what we all do. But I think what's incredibly interesting about legal in general is that because you have your 12 or 13 assets, clearly there's such an incredible mine of data that you can get access to. And it'd be lovely to hear a bit more about that from you.
Yeah, there are lots of... I'll answer.
Jenny, you asked the question.
The amount of energy that went into like not passing
know.
out during that question.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Actually quite honourable.
Are you there?
Hay fever.
Is it?
You're right though.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
You take it.
So I think delving into that data point a bit more is really interesting, because obviously you've amassed incredibly rich data over the time that you've had in the sector. And I'm really interested to hear how that now informs your decisions, and how you really use that to your advantage.
Yeah, so last year, 2023, for those listening to this in the future, in 2023, we had 6,000 lease events across our portfolio. So 6,000 things happened, leases were signed, extended, broken, whatever it was, 6,000 of them. And we can match that up with the information about the people that lived in the apartments and how long they had lived there, and what they went on to do and where they went on to live and how far they went on to move. And all of that becomes really interesting. I'm a bit data geeky, so I find it quite interesting for the sake of it being interesting. The challenge is to turn it into something that changes your decision making, and changes your decision making in a considered, moral, correct way, using that data in the right way, to see how it changes your information. You know, a really simple one is, how do you set the rents? How do you use that data to set the rents correctly? We don't have the technology that exists in the US, where there's rent optimization and computer tells you what the rent's going to be. And so, you know, a very simple challenge: what's it worth to have a balcony on your apartment? And we know before COVID, it cost more to build a balcony than it was worth. And we know that after COVID, it's worth more than it costs to build. And so there has been a change in demand because of that. But when we've got 5,000 apartments, we can look at the price difference on apartments across different locations and different schemes for having a balcony, for having a gym, for having a swimming pool, for having these different elements, and try and break them out. And even the distance between, you know, the additional rent that could be generated from an apartment right next to the amenity space versus one further away. We've had hours of debates, and we don't know what the right answer is for our scheme in Wandsworth, where we have a building which is right next to the entrance to the train station, right next to the platform. and we've got another one which is right next to the amenity space and the swimming pool and the lounge. And it is personal. Would you prefer to spend more money on your rent to be by the pool or to be by the lounge? And that's a personal decision. So we can have all the data we want. It might give us probabilities, but it still becomes personal. So then a lot of value comes in the anecdotal rather than just the pure data. And the value comes from going and speaking to the people that live in your buildings. And I guess even that gets a bit skewed because you don't speak to everybody. You speak to whoever's willing to speak to you or happens to be walking past at the time. But understanding why they live in your building, how they use it, which areas do they value. I personally find those most interesting, speaking to different ages and why they live in our buildings and understanding what they like, what they don't like, that sort of thing.
And how do you think, I suppose, that data then goes on to influence your marketing as well? Because, I'm sure you use that to then target certain audiences. How do you use that and then enhance?
Yeah, so something that just blows my mind is 15 to 20% of our residents find us via social media, principally Instagram.
That's incredible.
That is incredible.
Not lettings portals, but social media. And so you try and unpack that. If you unpack that, why are people on Instagram? Why are things popping up? Well, there's advertising. That means that our building pops up on their stream. But then trying to unpack, people are on Instagram because they want to be seen to associate themselves with a certain lifestyle. This is sweeping statements from a man in his, let's go for mid-40s, who is, joined, social media started when I was in my early 20s, so I'm sort of not grown up with it. But people are, just living their best life, taking photos that are, airbrushed to make themselves look better than they really are. They don't put the nitty-gritty photos of their life on Instagram of them, arguing with the kids about trying to get them out to school. The photos are all perfect, and they're trying to portray a certain lifestyle. And so that's definitely influenced our thinking about our buildings of what lifestyle do we want to portray for our residents, and how do we do that? So an example that we think is key is something our market really values is low carbon. So ESG, yes, but also low carbon specifically. So how can we portray the fact that our buildings genuinely are low carbon? How can we provide the data and the facts to prove it so it's not greenwashing? And how can we do that through social media? And then people can associate their own lifestyles with living low carbon lives through social media.
That's really interesting because most people in the industry would say, ESG is something we do as responsible investors. It's something we want to target. It's going to generate a premium when we exit. But actually, the consumer doesn't really care.
So one of the great things of working in the build-to-rent sector is I see no conflict between investment return and environmental impact, positive environmental impact, because the ultimate customer, the person who pays the rent, our ultimate customer isn't our investors. The ultimate person is the one who pays the rent. They care. So about 75% of our residents are aged 20 to 35. That age group really care about the environment. And we have started to get pretty technical questions from people looking around our schemes. We had somebody saying, what is the carbon footprint of living in this building? That is pretty techie, scientific, requested information.
That's quite fascinating, actually.
And in 5 years' time, that could be a standard question. That could be a standard required reporting number on any advert that we put out for trying to find residents. So it is not a choice, it's a requirement. Our customer, our occupiers demand it, that we have to be able to demonstrate that we are low carbon, energy efficient, having a positive impact to the wider community. We're not just an insular gated community. They want to associate themselves with a lifestyle like that.
And you talked obviously about the residents and speaking to residents on site. And I personally think in the industry that the resident part of the conversation is often glossed over to some extent, certainly in the media and the conversations that investors have between others. It's all about the returns and driving the rental growth, and obviously OPEX and obviously exit yields as well, which are clearly important. But ultimately, in the operational sector, we are all working for that end consumer, and that end consumer's got to be incredibly happy with the building, because otherwise ultimately it's not going to be a sustainable project. So I suppose the question for you is, when you're going around these buildings and speaking to residents, what are the kind of key things that they're telling you, and what has been almost the most memorable kind of insightful experience you've had with one of the residents? And has that then changed your perspective in some way, or changed your approach to how you're doing various different things in the schemes that you own and operate?
Yeah, they're very quick at letting you know if the internet's not quick enough. That's probably the first thing they'll do. Very quick at that, yeah. I think that there's one conversation I had that really sticks out, which was with a couple in a scheme of ours in Manchester who were retired. So not our normal demographic, and maybe 5% of our residents are retired. And they had previously owned a home and sold it. And they had taken the capital and given it to their grandkids. And they wanted to enjoy watching their grandchildren enjoy their inheritance. And their grandkids bought a house, and they were able to get on the housing ladder. And these people were going to rent, and they were confident that we had somehow, we're not great at it, we had got the message across that we're a long-term owner. We're not going to sell individual apartments. There is occupational security. They could sign a 5-year lease. So they had got comfortable they weren't going to be thrown out, or there was no risk of being asked to move. And then they started talking about stuff that I'd never thought about. The anxiety of home ownership was the phrase, which was they were pensioners. They had their pension to live off, and they had all of their wealth tied up in a house, and their anxiety was the boiler was going to break, or they had to change a bathroom, or they had a leaky roof. And they would have sudden capital costs, one-off costs, that they would have to go and find the money for from somewhere. Otherwise, their house was crumbling. And they saw that by renting, they were paying a fixed amount to us, and we were taking that responsibility off them. And I'd never thought of renting in that way, that they were paying us to take the responsibility of the upkeep of the building, but they were still living there. And I think that's made me think a lot about how we can target an older demographic in the rental sector. And this is a wider UK thing, not an L&G thing, but how can we provide good quality accommodation? It's not accommodation with care, it's just for rent in a community of mixed ages. That is attractive. That is attractive for an older demographic to go and move into for the long term, where the stress is taken out of it all. There's a community there. There's somebody 24/7 in the building if they need it. If they have or want to pass money on to other generations, they can do. I think it probably needs a university student writing a dissertation to really get into the economic or psychological impact of that. But I think that's it's stuck with me as a really interesting and thoughtful approach.
That is a really interesting learning, isn't it? And I think even the younger generations, the millennials, Gen Z, and now Gen Alpha that are coming forward, it seems like they're becoming less and less willing to want to do those administrative tasks, to own their own home. And actually, they're much happier to just live somewhere where everything's done for them. You know, they're used to it in the student housing market. That's now flushing through into the wider living sector. But the subscriptions around, I know we've talked about it quite a lot, you know, Netflix, Spotify, and having all these other services, they're used to having a subscription-based model, so why not?
And sharing as well. I think that idea of sharing, you know, having shared kind of communal spaces and that community element is something that they're also really used to, whether that's kind of online or offline. And that, you know, diminishing aspiration for home ownership. Perhaps that, I think that will always be there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think, it's going anywhere. But I do think the aspiration nowadays, when you're talking to the younger generations, a different, whether it's, even whether that's something that's going to be accessible to them throughout their lifetime, or whether they want the freedom. Maybe they don't want to be pinned down. Maybe they don't want all their money, in one place at one time. That emphasis on experience as well. Mm-hmm. I wonder how that kind of feeds into how you look at this kind of BTR sector.
Yeah, it again, it comes back to it being so culturally different that I know I've got a friend who's Swiss who couldn't comprehend buying a house. Why on earth would I want to be tied down to living in one location? What makes me think that I'm always going to want a house that looks like that? It's really expensive to move. But ultimately, what we don't have at the moment is enough choice. There isn't enough choice to rent a certain lifestyle, own a certain lifestyle through home ownership, because there aren't enough houses. And a lack of homes is reducing the options to go and buy. But it shouldn't reduce the quality options of your lifestyle and your living. And we really are trying, we had this phrase right at the beginning, which is, I rent because I want to, not because I have to. And how can we create a rental sector that is positive and it is not seen as a second-class option because you have failed, you can't afford to buy a home, you rent. It needs to be, wow, aren't you lucky, aren't you fortunate, you're so successful, you're able to rent in somewhere amazing. And it's trying to turn it around into something positive. And that is political messaging and rhetoric from Westminster. But that is building the homes and going and showing what's out there. I mean, a huge advantage we have now relative to 7, 8, 10 years ago when we started out is we've got schemes up and built. And we can go and show policymakers and councils and planners around schemes and investors and residents and go and explain this is what purpose-built rental accommodation looks like. I compare that to our first conversations when we did our first schemes and we'd go and see planners and we go and say we're going to build to rent. And they thought that meant we were going to build and then sell each apartment to a private landlord who would then rent them out individually because they couldn't comprehend an individual party just building hundreds of apartments and keeping ownership of them. But it's that, how can we make the rental sector aspirational?
Yeah.
That's the challenge.
Well, I was listening to the Future of Everything conference that I think was being done by the Wall Street Journal a few days ago. And what was really interesting is one of the commentators was saying that the viewpoint of what people actually want has changed as well. So the previous generations have wanted in America, what they call the white picket fence, the garden, the single family house, the ownership, the feeling of the fact that you've got the American dream. Obviously in the UK that's slightly different, but with a similar trait. And now the aspiration is much more about enriching your life, travel, restaurants, experiences, and enjoying the kind of well-being element of exploring the world and sort of doing different things, and whether that's remote working, whether that's being a digital nomad, whether that's various kinds of activities, or even moving between jobs. So I think that was really insightful because we're not in the same arena as where we were, and the aspirations of people and their priorities have changed, and rental accommodation provides sometimes a much better opportunity for people, not only in those buildings, but also to live life in a very different way than their parents or their parents before them. So that was quite kind of interesting, and I think we'll see more of that.
I'm always careful about saying what other people think or what do they feel, or that are people now really interested in experience rather than ownership? And all the evidence says it. I'm just always a bit uncomfortable about saying it. It sounds, I don't know, I feel a bit presumptuous, arrogant. Sort of try not to say those, but I see it. But if you, the way I've been trying to explain rental to policymakers is, let's jump into some huge assumptions here. So let's assume that everybody starts independent living when they start at uni. Let's assume everybody goes to uni. That's clearly not the case, but let's say everybody leaves home at 18. You then live in something specific for, it could be co-living, it could be student accommodation, it could be HMOs. There's something specific for that first move out of home for 3 or 4 years. Then you rent from 20 to probably 35, 40. What's the age of the average first-time buyer? Something like that. And then you own a home and you settle down and you have your 2.4 kids and you have your white picket fence and a pet, yeah. And you spend your days doing school runs and that sort of thing. And then the kids get to 20 and they all disappear, or 18 and 20 and they disappear. And then you either stay where you are or you move into something that's specific for your age. And what I think so much focus in terms of planning policy is around that one bit between 35 and 60, 65, something like that, about the home ownership bit, which is maybe half, of your independent living life. And there isn't enough focus and time spent on the bits either end. And so that's assuming that everybody wants the white picket fence. But there isn't enough time spent at the other ends. Do our planners spend 2 days a week thinking about the rental market and 1 day a week thinking about later living and 2 days a week about home ownership? I doubt it.
Unlikely.
And I think if you think of that whole spectrum of different tenures of ownership, we have a shortage in all of those. There's no oversupply in any of those bits of housing. But it's still so much of the focus is on one area in terms of home ownership, rather than how can we support people to get on the rental ladder? How can we support people to get into later living accommodation? How can we support people to live in purpose-built student accommodation? What are those other support mechanisms that could be around there?
Yeah.
So should we switch gear a bit and move on to the next section?
Yep.
So I think sort of this section is much more about the future of the real estate sector, and obviously there's so many trends moving forward, whether that's artificial intelligence, technology, how we kind of treat the resident experience. And I think what would be really fascinating is obviously someone who has been at the forefront of the BTR sector, now obviously moving into various other living sectors across the board, legal in general, but seeing the broad variety of different subsectors within the marketplace. I suppose the question is, what does the future of our industry potentially hold? And then a separate question is kind of, what is the hopes for the sector moving forward as well?
Yeah, I'd like to think it's down to residential, but I don't think it is entirely. But I think we're seeing a big shift towards operational real estate, which I'll explain. So this is moving beyond the residential sector, but generally we are seeing real estate investment is no longer 25-year leases to an investment grade occupier, and the landlord sits back for 20 years and takes the rent. That there's a small part of that market, but increasingly being an owner of real estate is being a provider and supporter of space for businesses to be operated out of. At our Wandsworth scheme, we're doing a lot of work on how can we support SME retailers to enliven the ground floor. And it's going to be supporting, and we've done this elsewhere in the UK, but it is genuinely partnering with SME retailers and choosing them based on us having shared principles. And we have to make them better businesses. The role of the owner of real estate is different. It is not buy it, build it, let it. It is then support your operator, your occupier, and make them a better occupier. It's verging towards an asset manager these days having to have a little bit of architecture, a little bit of RICS qualifications, a little bit of Deborah Meaden and Dragon's Den to support the businesses in growth. It's a much wider skill set, and and I think because institutions have got comfortable with that operational risk through the residential sector, maybe through hotels and through student accommodation and other sectors like self-storage, and that's increasingly moving to other wider commercial real estate sectors as well.
Feels like, as you say, investors have almost got to be, to some extent, incubators or supporters or these accelerators where they've got the physical real estate space, they know that the community needs this space, but it's how they can effectively enable local communities, whether that is businesses, whether that's more charities, community groups, food banks, support groups, or people living in the building, to kind of promote those causes. And I think that is an incredible shift, isn't it, from just doing straightforward leases to actually, what you were talking to us about when you were at MIPIM is how you have, as a business, kind of got different businesses involved in talking to them, working with them, effectively mentoring them, providing them the space. But the space isn't everything. It's also part of a much bigger program.
Yeah, we've, at our Walthamstow scheme, again, I keep coming back to it, but at our Walthamstow scheme, we've got a new concept there called Foundry. So Foundry, we opened maybe 6 months ago, and it was from demand from our residents, and it is co-working space, micro retail, which I can explain, and a bar, because I like beer and pizza, remember, so we have to have a bar.
Always back to that one.
And it was from seeing so many residents working in our lounges and communal space. And when we designed that scheme pre-COVID, that was a lounge space and space for people to get together in the evenings. It wasn't designed to be used 24/7 as an office, which is what it would become. And so we put in dedicated offices for 2 to 6 people, individual desks people could hire. And then we let all of the office space over a weekend on Instagram again. So no office agents involved, just let over a weekend, which showed the incredible demand. All local SME businesses, people coming out of their spare bedrooms and wanting then their first step into renting an office. And then the ground floor micro retail is rooms a bit bigger than this one. Not great for those listening to this rather than watching it, but like a couple of 100 square feet, and we've got residents running retail out of there. So we've got a doggy groomer, a barber's, somebody does aesthetics, if you know what that is. I had to look it up. But anyway, won't talk about that. But it's really interesting to see we've created space that is an extension of where our residents live, that is allowing them to grow their businesses, and it works economically. But on paper, you need some faith in that investment underwrite. You need some faith that the occupiers are there. The benefit of having nearly 1,000 people living in your building is you can go and ask them, if we go and build this space, will you use it? Do you run a business? Would you like some space as a shop or as somewhere to operate out of? But that is that partnering interaction with who's already living in the building. In a way, that's de-risked it for us. It's less risk because we know the people in our building want to use that space. So we're able to directly speak to the potential occupiers.
And then in terms of kind of experience, we've talked a lot about experience and operations, but if we weren't talking about financials and financials weren't such an important part of our industry, what would be the dream experiences or dream hard amenity spaces that you would love to offer to residents? Or do you feel that that's already been done? Is there anything that you would sort of wake up at night and think to yourself, wow, I'd love to offer this, but it's so expensive, I could never dream of doing it?
Maybe the most ridiculous amenities I've seen in the States, bowling alley, full-size bowling alley,
It's pretty cool.
basketball court, virtual basketball court.
Wow.
So a giant screen, maybe 20 feet by 10 feet, which was all virtual, indoor golf, that sort of stuff. So we've in our schemes, we put in a gym, which has to be a proper professional gym. Otherwise, what's the point? It's got to be there to save our residents from having to be a member of a gym somewhere else. Not everybody wants to be a member of a gym, so not everybody puts any value on a gym, but some people do. So it's got to be decent. So we have a gym. There is a lounge, which is we used to call a lounge, and now we call co-working space. But that has to be flexible.
Yeah.
Moving walls, the ability to change and evolve through the day, through the years, really important, because what people want today is not what they'll want in 5 years' time. So we have that everywhere. We have private dining rooms everywhere, really popular. And the idea is, well, my throwaway comment is always that people who live in studios do have friends and they want to have them over for dinner. And so they can go and have this, great space. It's great for marketing of the building. But the idea is people feel their apartments are bigger because they've got space to expand into with private dining rooms. And then we had never put in a cinema room until we have a scheme in Lewisham that's just completed. And I went to see it last week. And I went into the cinema room and thought, wow, this actually looks pretty good. I don't know whether anybody will ever use it. But I thought, God, it'd be great to sit in here and watch the football. And it was the first bit of amenity that I've looked at for a while where I just thought, actually, that stands out as being something different. And we've never put it in because the advice we've heard from other people that have is they're just not used. They're great for marketing, but nobody uses cinema rooms. So I think we've got a consistent set of things we always put in. We've got swimming pools in 3 schemes, I think. And it's always successful. They've always been successful to have a swimming pool. They haven't leaked. That's the important thing. They haven't leaked. But you really need a very big scheme to be able to afford to put in a swimming pool because that's expensive.
A real wow factor, isn't it?
Yeah, and scheme number 1, when we were sitting around deciding what to put in there in the swimming pool, we were saying, well, if nobody ever uses it, it'll still be valuable for the marketing and it'll look great. And people use it. It's great. I time my visits with showing people around that scheme with when I know the mothers and babies do their swimming lessons. Because it just looks like it's completely staged for a start. It looks like it's all been staged. But it shows the wider demographic of people that live in the building, that they're using it for good, for teaching their kids how to swim and that sort of thing. It's great.
And then I'd love to kind of ask you, we really delved into this from a co-living perspective with our last guest around, community and design being the hardware, but community really being the software. And, there are obviously lots of similarities between co-living and BTR, but of course, many differences too. And I just wonder how you see that kind of community element in BTR, as slightly different, and if so, what are the nuances, and is it becoming more important?
Yeah, we spent so long talking about community at the beginning and how this is going to be great. Everybody's going to be really good friends with each other, and the made up statistics about if you know one person in your flat, you're going to stay for an extra year or whatever it was. I'm sure they were made up, but they were talked about a lot. And so it was all about getting everybody to know each other. And we've got great examples of people that have met each other in our buildings, have got married, have had kids. Amazing. Kids at home births in our buildings.
Wow.
Things like that. Yeah, I mean, you then have an empty apartment because they move in together, so that's not great. But some great stories like that, which are really nice to hear. But if we spend too long trying to do events, it becomes a bit false. I think what we started out with, when we have a new scheme, we'll start by running events and getting people together and probably buy beer and pizza. There's a theme here, isn't there?
Yes.
And we'll get people together and try and organise events. But over time, you end up with we've referred to them as community champions, but people in the building who take over.
Yeah.
And it's much more genuine if it's people in the community rather than the general manager of the building saying, Thursday night, it must be fun.
Yeah.
Fun night, Thursday night, get it in the diary. Whereas somebody in it, and it's organic, it depends on the people that live in the building. So the Slate Yard we've got in Salford, there we had a resident who did open mic nights. And,
So fun.
just did, as in music, not comedy. And through some accident where he was meant to be on that night, wasn't open or had to close. So he just did an open mic night in the communal space. And that became a regular thing. And then the whole building was known as, it got associated with live music. And it was being live streamed on Facebook. And but it was completely organic. What we provided was some space and hopefully a style and approach that didn't say the rules say you can't do that. So this sounds like something pretty cool. Go and do your music. And then other residents would come and join. And there was a 10-year-old who was a pianist who was amazing, and somebody else who was a jazz singer, and all these people. And they'd just go on, and all the residents would come down, and it would be live streamed. And it was just much more organic.
Yeah.
And so it's that fine line of facilitating versus just get out of the way and let the community go and form for themselves and create their own groups.
People can feel when it's forced, can't they? And it's like forced fun, and having that more authentic, more organic, in resident sort of community spirit, I think is so much nicer, because it feels like you're getting together for a reason rather than just getting together for the sake of it, or for the fact that the building has certain events that it needs to put on every year to show as a tick box exercise. Not that I think a lot of buildings do put on really good events, and they have fantastic community managers to do that. But I agree with you. I think there's a lot to be achieved when you have sort of the residents pioneering that spirit.
There are some things that we think we definitely have to do. So they're grabbing businesses and people from outside of the community, outside of the building, and bringing them in. I think that's our job. So once a year we do we run markets on every scheme on the same day, where we bring in low carbon, environmentally aware businesses to go and promote their stuff.
Brilliant. And
it's food and clothing and all sorts of things, and they come in. And so that is us organising a bigger event, and it's our teams on site organising those bigger events and getting everybody together. But the smaller things of, let's put up the Christmas decorations. Well, get out of the way. The residents want to do that.
Yeah.
Just provide them with the space to do it, and maybe they need a budget, maybe they don't, but let them get on with it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Do you want to touch on student, and then we'll go on to the final?
Well, yeah, I just want to touch on one question, if that's okay. So I think obviously as an investor, a lot of people are quite interested in how you think about new transactions that come across your desk, and forward funding, buying land, various different projects as well. And I think from our perspective, obviously as an agency, it's really useful to get an inkling of the things that you think could be really interesting to investors like yourself, because clearly the marketplace has been quite consistent for quite a long period of time in terms of churning out quite sort of standard PDF brochures and quite long-winded brochures and technical brochures. But is there things that you feel as an investor, and obviously an investor that has been in the industry for a period of time, would or does really captivate your attention and would sort of get you or similar investors excited about a project that might not have been communicated via similar methods or other kind of ways of doing things which have been a bit more corporatized, should we say?
Yeah, so if I go back, so last quarter, we received 170 introductions to deals that were all forward fundings or land deals that accounted for 37,000 apartments.
Wow.
And there are a couple of those that we're looking at running on, but we're definitely in the 1% or sub 1% that we then actually progress that we'd look at. The first question the majority of the questions have nothing to do with the economics. The economics either works or it doesn't work. All of the early questions are about location. Do you want to live there? Is it going to get better? Where's the high street? Where do I go out for my food? How far is it to get my groceries? All of those initial questions are about location. Nothing is about the money. And it is, as a group, would you want to live there? Have you lived there? Do you know that area? And is it going to change? Is it going to get better? Is it going to get worse? So it's entirely about understanding that location to start with. That's what, almost, the majority of things that are discarded straight away, it's location. Irrespective, it could deliver great investment returns, but if it's not in the right location, then it's not going to work when we're thinking really long term. So we're thinking 40 years. And what's that location going to be like over the next 40 years? How aspirational is that location? So it's really understanding the area is the most important thing.
So do you feel like if there was an opportunity for an agency like ourselves to bring that location to life for areas that maybe aren't quite as well known, or even areas that are known but haven't been frequented by members of the team, so whether that's video content, social media activity, websites, something that's really interactive, speaking to residents, for example, is that something that you think your team would resonate with and sort of help them to sort of potentially understand things a bit better early on in the process?
Yeah, something we've been looking for on our schemes is who's the local champion? Who's the local person that understands the local businesses, that understands, what cool stuff's happening in that area at the moment? Who can explain the culture of that area? Who can explain, you want to go to that coffee shop because it's really good, and you don't want to go over there because it's not actually been roasted locally. And how do you find those local champions? And you don't get those in a prospectus. You don't get those in a prospectus. You get some travel times about how far it is to where people work, rather than that detail of the community and the lifestyle. And we're trying to work out what it's going to be like to live there. And some of that is commuter times and how long. What's your front door to your desk commuter time? But yeah, who are the local champions? What's their story? Why do they love where do they live? What are they doing where they live? What are the events that, if we build something, our residents would be going to in that area? It's trying to understand that wider lifestyle point.
I think it's really interesting because when you think about the way that you then market your schemes to the end consumer, it's almost taking that same mindset back and saying, okay, we're using, when we're looking at an asset years before anyone's ever going to live in it, it's almost doing that piece of work beforehand. So when you're looking at an asset, it's almost putting that marketing hat on and thinking, okay, let's get under the skin of this area, because how are we then going to sell it? If we buy it, how are we then going to sell it to residents? So it's almost doing that piece of work really early on before you've even taken on the project, and establishing those really important aspects of lifestyle, like you say, that's going to end up selling that scheme, and be aspirational to those end consumers.
Yeah. One of the really early things we do is get our branding sorted out for that building, which is and that's ideally before we finish the design of the building, because the brand of the building will influence the design, and not just in the interiors and the wayfinding and the signs over the doors. All of that branding influences the amenity that we're going to provide, how big it is, the mix of apartments, whether it's studios, 1s, 2s, 3s. So if we can get that branding first, and that branding is rooted in that specific location, so to understand what the local community champions care about, that is what will influence what the brand should be. And you can make some terrible mistakes. You can name buildings that suddenly everybody finds really offensive, or the name isn't rooted in that location, it's rooted somewhere else in the world. And so you've got to understand that early on.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously very passionate about kind of bringing that lifestyle element to investors, and it's about how do you get an understanding of the lifestyle 5 years before it might be actually fully stabilized.
Yeah.
And something we're certainly exploring in the Harris Studio side of our business.
Well, you need to go and stay there.
Yeah.
You need to go to the location and stay there, and you need to stay there overnight and at weekends. You can't just walk in during business hours and see what's happening in an area. Most of your residents aren't going to be there during business hours, so it's not relevant for them. So what's it like at the weekend?
Yeah, definitely. Jen, do you want to move on to the final questions?
Yeah. So I have 2 final questions. The first one is, so I suppose if we kind of have got an insight into the kind of chapters of your life up to this point, which I think we really have in this podcast, and it's been really, really insightful, what would you call kind of the chapter that you feel like you're in right now?
So whether it's life or the sector, so my career life, it feels like we've finished nursery school for build to rent. Maybe we're just starting infant school or primary school or something. We're still right at the beginning of the journey, though. We're nowhere close to maturing. We're still learning about what we're doing. We've still, there's a few people at infant school who are always really confident and they think they're winning and way ahead of everybody else and just doing a bit better, and they're always happy to tell everybody that. And then there's some that are a little bit quieter and still evolving and speeding up and catching up. I think we're just so early on still. The general public doesn't know we exist as a sector, and we've delivered 100,000 homes as a sector in 5 years. So we're still at the beginning. And when I try and persuade graduates and real estate professionals, and definitely non-real estate professionals, into the sector, to try and say that the rules still don't exist in the institutional ownership of residential. The rules don't exist in the UK in the way that the rules about how you're meant to asset manage an office exist. It's still being made up. There's still loads of room for innovation. It's a really interesting sector for people to get into and work in. And there's I think a real great thing in the sector is there's no hierarchy, because actually the people who are just coming into the sector probably have more experience of renting than the people that have been in it for years and years. Their view is more valuable than mine. And so the ability to come in and influence and see change is really immediate. But a challenge we've got is to make sure talent in the industry knows there is an institutional residential sector that needs innovation and entrepreneurs that they should be moving into.
And if there was just one aspect of the real estate sector that you would want to reinvent, what would that be?
To reinvent, I think there's a lot to be done in the later living sector. I think there's a lot there that is. It's so much of it is cultural. So there's a whole cultural piece and a branding of the sector. But I think there's a huge amount in the later living sector that can be done to have a big positive societal impact. So I think that would be really interesting to work on.
Great.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. We've covered everything from, the early stages of BTR, its evolution, where Dan sees it going, and we've found it incredibly interesting and absolutely recommend you watch the full episode. So make sure you do on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Music. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you so much. Should I press it?
Yeah.